Hi guys, now today we're going to concentrate on Poppies in July by Sylvia Plath. So remember that it's very important that you keep up to date with all the videos and that you have a good look, of course, at the biographical details that I spoke about the last day. So Poppies in July then was written or composed in July, obviously, of 1962, but it wasn't published until after she died. So it was published posthumously, okay, which is just basically a fancy word of saying after she died. So when we look at the title, first of all, we could say that it is misleading, and by the end of the poem, we see it as quite ironic. So Poppies in July is a quite straightforward title, and we think, of course, as the poppy then obviously is a natural image, a natural feature, and it comes to represent two or three different ideas throughout the poem, so it becomes a very powerful or potent symbol in the poem. So July then, of course, would emphasize a warm summer month. So that, in a way, then would be quite misleading because we think, of course, that this is going to be a very positive poem about the beauty or the joy of nature. But as we'll see, of course, the poem is very bleak and very dark and very gloomy. Now, when we think about the image of a poppy first and foremost, usually they're wildflowers. Sometimes they can be cultivated. There are lots of different types. I think there are up to 19 different types of poppies in existence. Usually when we think of a poppy, we think of the bright red flower. And as I said, it's usually a wild flower. It's usually the white poppy then that is actually cultivated and is used then, of course, for harvesting opium. So if we think about the poppy itself then, so it has large red petals and they're usually kind of creased or lined. So they look kind of crinkled, a little bit like crepe paper. And they're usually, the head of the flower then is usually balanced on top of a long stalk. And the stalk itself is usually quite slim or quite thin, quite reedy. So the poppy looks quite fragile. It looks as if this particular stalk or stem is going to bend or snap. But the reality is that it just simply waves essentially in the breeze. And we do see that then when she's describing it in the poem. So you might suggest that the poppy then looks delicate or fragile, but it's actually quite resilient. And this could relate back to Plath as well. Think about it, she's quite a vulnerable person, but at other times then she can be quite tough and quite independent as such too. Okay, so when we think about the poppy flower itself, obviously it has become a symbol then in literature, but also in real life. So if we think about the poppy that can be worn in November of each year, it is used then to symbolize how we commemorate the end of the First World War. So that's 1918. So the British Legion in England, for example, in Great Britain then will sell poppies. Fewer people in Ireland would wear them because obviously of our history associated with Britain. So the poppy then comes to represent those who have fallen, those who have died, or those who have sacrificed their lives as a result of the Great War, the First World War, and it also commemorates those who have died in subsequent wars. So that's why it's associated with that. Now, you might kind of think, okay, why is it specifically associated with the First World War? Because poppies started to grow in the disturbed soil as a result of the trenches that were dug during the First World War. Okay, so following on from the First World War, because of the disturbed soil, essentially, the poppies started to flourish and grow. So they have become associated then with the trenches of the First World War. They become associated then with the fields in Flanders, in Belgium, and of course in France that saw horrific battles and horrific bloodshed and death at that particular time. So think about it. Red usually represents or symbolizes life and energy and vitality. Red usually symbolizes, of course, love and passion, if we think of a red rose. But red can also symbolize, of course, the notion of pain and suffering, the idea of bloodshed and death and warfare. So there are lots of different connotations, lots of different ideas that she's suggesting by using the natural image or symbol of the poppy itself. Now, if you think about it, some species then of poppy will actually be associated with opium. And if you think of opium, of course, then is a drug. I mean, basically a painkiller, a heavy duty painkiller. So it's a drug, of course, that is a kind of precursor to heroin. So people can smoke it or inject it. So if you think about it, a drug is associated with escape. Okay, so when she's talking about these particular images of capsules, for example, she is longing for an escape from the heartbreak or from the suffering that she's experiencing. So very simply, you can boil the poem down to the idea that she is longing for either sleep, release, escape, death. Okay, so those are the kind of key ideas then that you will find in the poem. So at the very beginning of the poem then, she poses a simple question. So we have to decide, is this a direct question or is this a rhetorical question? Is she seeking an answer or is the answer implied in the question itself? So little poppies, I mean little would suggest sort of delicate and beautiful. Little hell flames, do you do no harm? So the second metaphor that she uses there, the second image, little hell flames, is a disturbing image. It's quite an unusual image because she is comparing the poppies dancing in the breeze to flickering or fluttering hell flames. And think of the word hell, that's used very specifically here. It's not just a flame or a fire, it's the fire of hell itself. And hell would suggest the notion of torture or torment. It would suggest the idea of suffering and punishment. So she is living a kind of hell, then a personal hell, because think about her personal circumstances at that particular time. She is now living on her own with her 2 children in the ramshackle farmhouse in Devon, and her husband has deserted her. So we have a real sense then of her anguish, a real sense of her despair, a real sense of her hopelessness as well. You could say the reason that she uses a question here is because she's confused and unsure and uncertain about herself, about her life, about her future. And there is the idea, of course, that the harm could represent the notion of self-harm. And think about it, her suicide attempts, of course, would reinforce that as such, how she longs for the relief of sleep or death itself. So, little poppies, little hell flames. Notice how she uses repetition quite a lot in the poem. If you think, kind of think of that sort of repetitive element, it's almost as if she's kind of becoming sort of drowsy and weak. There's a kind of a sleepiness or a soporific feel, a kind of a dreaminess that happens throughout the poem. Little poppies, little hell flames, do you do no harm? Because think about it, of course, the poppy, if it's used in terms of opium or heroin, can be dangerous. Okay, so think of an overdose, for example, even though it can kill the pain, and it can, of course, create this aura of joy and escape as such. You flicker, and think of the word flicker, it just means a sudden movement, like a fluttering movement. I cannot touch you. I put my hands among the flames. Nothing burns. Notice the image of self-harm here again. It's the idea that she's so depressed and so tormented that she feels numb and cold. She cannot feel or respond to the world around her. It's the notion, of course, that she can't relate to the world around her because the world around her in the middle of summer is full of energy and dynamism. It's full of colour and beauty. But to her, of course, the world is just flat and grey and uneventful. So you have a constant contrast between the poppies and the poet as such. So think about it, they're opposites in the poem. Okay, Plath essentially feels flawed and tainted. She feels imperfect. The poppies, of course, are new formed flowers and they look perfect, pristine and beautiful. So she just feels ugly and wretched inside. Also think of the idea that she feels very passive, inactive, inert, whereas the poppies are very dynamic. They're full of vitality and energy because they're fluttering and dancing, of course, swaying over and back in the breeze itself. Also think about the structure of the poem. Notice how she is using couplets in this particular poem. That should remind you then of Robert Frost's poem that we did earlier in the year, The Tuft of Flowers. And think about it, a similar image as such, but that was a joyful poem. That was an optimistic, positive, hopeful poem. This, of course, is a poem about depression and hopelessness. So when she's using couplets here, she might be suggesting, of course, how isolated and lonely she feels. It may represent, we'd say, her husband and her husband's mistress. They are now a couple and she stands apart on her own. It may suggest, perhaps we say, a kind of a distance that she feels from her children as well. There's a kind of dislocation essentially there. So it's kind of reinforcing, maybe we'd say, her personal circumstances in the way that she's using, in the way that she's composing the lines and using these particular couplets. And it exhausts me to watch you, flickering like that, wrinkly and clear red like the skin of a mouth. Even the word exhaust here, that would suggest the tremendous depression that weighs her down. She just feels so tired and so weary and so depleted all of the time. She doesn't have the energy and dynamism that she had, of course, as a younger woman. She doesn't have that zest for life. There's no sense of joy. There's no sense of embracing the world and finding the happiness in it. So she says then, describing again flickering like that, think of the idea of a flame again. The word flickering is usually the idea of a burning flame, a moving flame, using repetition again. Then notice how she describes it. First of all, simple adjectives, but also then using a simile. So remember, she used a metaphor at the very beginning, comparing the poppies to little hell flames. Now she's comparing them to the skin of a mouth. So think of wrinkly and clear red. Well, wrinkly relates back to the idea of the lines or creases that you find in the poppy petal itself. So it's not very smooth, essentially. Remember I said it's crinkled like paper. Then if we think of clear red, that would suggest a vibrant, bright red. And remember, poppies do stand out then from the grass in the meadow. So using the simile like the skin of a mouth. And think about it, if you look at your lips, there are tiny little lines and little creases, essentially. And she's kind of thinking about the image of a mouth, not just, of course, a naked mouth, but we'd say lips that have been painted using lipstick. So they're bright red. And think about it, a bright red mouth, of course, is a very sensual or a very sexual image. It's an image of appeal and attraction. It's an image perhaps of passion that is associated with that particular image then as well. So she might be kind of weaving into the poem, as we'll see throughout the remainder of the poem, references and images then that allude to Asha Wellville. Remember, Asha Wellville was having an affair with Ted Hughes, Sylvia Plath's husband, and then he eventually left Sylvia Plath to be with her. So if we think about the image of the skin of the mouth, obviously it's an image of passion and sexuality. But she moves on then, a mouth just bloodied. Now here's where the imagery becomes even more extreme, quite disturbing and quite graphic. You could even say sort of grotesque and ugly as well. You know, the image of the hell flames, okay, they're sort of ominous and sinister. The image then, the skin of the mouth, can be seen as positive. But then when she moves on to using that very specific description then, a mouth just bloodied, we might say that that could relate back to her sense of frustration, her sense of anger and rage perhaps that's kind of boiling away inside but has yet to be expressed. And it's the idea, of course, that she wants to inflict harm on Ted Hughes and perhaps Asha Wellville as well. So think about it, the image of the poppy, of course, the red poppy, does suggest the notion of hurt, does suggest the notion of a battle, does suggest the notion then, of course, of suffering and pain and bloodshed. So it's all in keeping with that particular symbol that she's using throughout. Then she uses a very unusual metaphor, little bloody skirts. So think back to the shape of the petal again. It might suggest a short skirt, of course, usually worn by a woman. So if you think of little bloody skirts, a bright red skirt, kind of associated with seduction, perhaps attraction again, passion, relationship, sexuality, all of that. But also the little bloody skirts. Now think about the word skirt was used back in the 1950s and 60s then as a derogatory term a very negative term for women. Okay, so referring to a bit of skirt or a piece of skirt would be a vulgar way of referring to a woman. So it does have modern connotations, we'd say, of the word tart or even slut. Okay, so these particular hard-hitting words then and ideas and images are reinforced by the image that she's using then, the little bloody skirts. Little bloody skirts, of course, can also reinforce a uniquely female experience as well. So the bloody skirt could represent the idea of her miscarriage, perhaps. It could also suggest the idea of period blood as well. So it's the notion, of course, remember that she did suffer a miscarriage in the early 1960s, and now she feels kind of bereft and empty. So it could relate back to that particular suffering, the mental and emotional suffering of that. And it could also relate back to the notion then that she is alone, essentially, and she feels bereft. She feels this kind of emptiness, this void inside. So she continues, of course, to menstruate, but she is obviously sexually inactive and she is not having children. So notice how she uses the exclamation mark there, of course, to emphasize her anger and exasperation. There are fumes that I cannot touch. Now, fume is a very interesting word because it does suggest the notion of smoke. And that might remind you perhaps of the idea of smoking opium or heroin then as such, and the idea of taking drugs, first of all, to alleviate the pain, but also, of course, to ease the depression and the anxiety that she feels. So remember, of course, that she wasn't fully diagnosed in terms of her bipolar disorder, and doctors were prescribing various drugs to her, but none of them seemed to work. So she's becoming more and more kind of anguished as a result of that as well. So we think of the idea of the drug then as representing the notion of escape, escaping a world of pain and suffering. So she says, where are your opiates, your nauseous capsules? And think of a capsule, of course, representing like a soft pill that you would swallow. The capsule could represent the part of the poppy, of course, that produces the opium then as well. Nauseous just means something that makes you feel ill or sick, so giving you that sort of upset stomach. The opiate, of course, relates back to the idea of drugs or narcotics as well. So there is a kind of a desperation when she asks that particular question. Is there any drug that can alleviate her pain? Any drug that can make her feel better? So it's not just, of course, about the physical pain, it's about the emotional pain, the spiritual pain that she's experiencing here as well. So notice how she uses in the next couplet, if I could bleed or sleep, if my mouth could marry a hurt like that. So the if would suggest how she's longing or yearning, wishing essentially for some kind of relief, some kind of escape. So if I could bleed, because the bleed would suggest, of course, something physical. If she could feel anything at all, because her body just feels cold and empty and numb. And the bleeding, of course, could relate back to just physical pain, but it could also relate back to, of course, the idea then of period blood as well. So if I could bleed or sleep, if my mouth could marry a hurt like that. So in a way, it relates back to the notion of self-harm. Can she inflict some kind of harm on herself, and then at least she'd feel something rather than nothing? If you think of how she's using the word marry there as a verb, it's a clever pun, because to marry here just simply means to bring together. Something is kind of interlocking as such, joining together. So to marry a hurt, if I could feel a hurt like that, is what she's saying. But also think about why she's hurting. She's hurting, of course, because her husband has deserted her. Her husband has left her, has abandoned her. So she is left behind, and she essentially then, of course, has to think about him being with another woman. So marriage then, of course, has caused nothing but pain and suffering to her. She has a very cynical attitude towards it then. So it's quite clever the way that she's using that very specific verb. So moving on then to the penultimate or second last verse. Or your liquors seep to me in this glass capsule. Now remember that liquor, of course, is usually an American word that represents alcohol. It can just simply mean a liquid as well. But if you think of the idea of liquor here, of course, it would suggest escaping your sorrows or drowning your sorrows by drinking alcohol. So the notion, of course, that she's longing for any kind of escape route. Okay, so taking drugs, of course, or drinking herself into oblivion. That's really what she's emphasizing here. And it's reinforcing that sense of longing and yearning, just wishing that she could escape the suffering itself. So your liquor seeped to me in this glass capsule. Now this is a metaphor essentially, and it represents the world itself. If you think of a glass capsule, it's supposed to remind us, of course, not just of the idea of a capsule as in a pill, as in medication or drugs, but a bell jar that you will find in a science lab. And remember that her novel, her semi-autobiographical novel, was called The Bell Jar. So a bell jar is used in a science lab, and it is a vacuum essentially. You put something inside and then you put the glass over it. Okay, so it has like a little format essentially. So it is used for experiments, or it's used to observe something, or it's used essentially then in gas work as well. So if you think about it, she is comparing then this world or her world to a bell jar or a glass capsule. She feels kind of suffocated, essentially. She feels as if everyone is looking at her and judging her. She feels as if she's being experimented on. Okay, so once more, it's quite a hard-hitting image. It's quite a dark and tragic image that she's using here. And it's also very disconcerting as well. It's a very sinister, very ominous image that she's using. So the second last line then, she says, dulling and stilling. Now, if you think about it, that might suggest the idea of the drugs taking effect. So kind of dulling her senses. She just becomes, of course, inert and still. But remember, of course, that it's also representing how she now feels as well. She just feels, of course, passive. Okay, that nothing can bring her joy, that she can't find the energy to do anything that brings her happiness or joy in life as such. And even the repetition of the sound effects here, think of dulling, stilling, kind of represents just that joylessness, just that inactivity, just that passivity as such too. So the last line then, notice it's a single line rather than a couplet, is isolated then from the remainder of the poem. And it is in sharp contrast to the very beginning of the poem, where we had the brightly coloured poppies dancing in the breeze. And they were compared then, of course, to little hell flames, usually orange or red. So, but colourless, colourless. And this is her reaction to the world around her. Even though she is surrounded in Devon by the beauty and vitality of nature, nothing makes her happy. Nothing brings her joy. So just there is that sense that the world is just grey, essentially, to her. Notice, of course, obviously the American spelling of colourless, colourless. Now, she does repeat that particular word, actually the repetition of those two words, in another poem, Elm, which focuses on her reaction to Ted Hughes's desertion of her and her sense of anguish. And towards the end is a kind of a hint that the sibilant S sound is supposed to represent the notion of gas. And that could allude then, of course, to the notion of a death wish, or of course her final and successful suicide attempt. Remember, she did actually take sleeping pills, and then she used the gas oven then to take her own life. So if you kind of think about it, there's a little hint there towards the end of not only a death wish, but a suicide attempt, and the method itself too. Okay, so I hope I've given you just sort of an overview here of the theme of the poem, which is actually quite straightforward. But remember, it's very important that you understand then, of course, all of the events of her life and that you're familiar with them, and then how they impinge on her attitude now, and how they impinge then on her response to life itself. So what you should do is you should practice then writing out a little paragraph on the theme of the poem, so the ideas explored in the poem, And then you should focus on 2 or 3 of the simple aspects of style. So you should be able to pick out something like her use of metaphors, or her use of similes, her use of natural images and symbols, her use of repetition, why she would use couplets and then at the very end use a single line representing herself and her sense of isolation or alienation or loneliness. Maybe a few different sound effects, if you kind of think, we say, of something like sibilance, or if we think of something like assonance. If there's anything at all, maybe onomatopoeia that you've noticed, jot it down. Okay, so like I said, keep it simple, 2 or 3 aspects of style, 2 or 3 techniques, and then make sure that you're able to write a paragraph on the theme of the poem. And don't forget to email me questions, or you can leave them in the comment section. Okay, until next week, guys. See you then.